If you'll indulge me for a minute, I'll tell you a little story. About 9 years ago, I was invited to join the board of Uniting Care Wesley Bowden, which is a medium-sized not-for-profit in the western suburbs and does a whole range of fabulous things. And that was great, and I joined and I really enjoyed it. And then a few years later, another member joined, a very tall man in a suit who looked very serious, and we're all sort of on our best behaviour. And that was great, and he was really helpful as well. And then a few years more, I became chair, and the tall man in the suit became the chair of the Audit Committee. And part of my role as chair was I had to do the board self-evaluation. So I duly sent out the survey, got the results, set up all the meetings to go in and talk with each of the board members about how they'd felt the experience was, what could we do better, were there any burning issues they wanted to discuss. And the hardest person to get into was, again, the tall man in the suit. And in the end, I said to his secretary, just like weekends, evenings, doesn't matter, just get me into his diary, I need to be in his diary. And that was the beginning of what we think that the AIC doesn't really promote enough when they talk about being a voluntary member on a board. So that was how I met the love of my life. Fast forward, we actually got married 8 months ago. So the tall man in the suit is Kim Cheetah, who I have the honour of introducing today. And I'm sure that I haven't stolen any of his thunder in his speech. So please welcome Kim.
Just so we're clear, I don't normally kiss the people who introduce me to speeches. Look, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for having me here today. From a PwC point of view, the opportunity to talk about the work we're doing in cities. Cities is one of those agenda items that we as a firm have wanted to invest time and effort into, not because there's work to be done as a professional services firm, not because there's money to be made, but because we actually think how our cities function, how they work for the people that live in them, and what it means in terms of how people live, work and play in our cities is such a really important issue for us as a community. I should also note that from a PwC point of view, we have another really important social issue that we also care enormously about and invested in a lot of effort and resource into, which is the issue of homelessness. So I also would like to thank you for your support of Catherine House with two different hats on, both as the husband of the CEO of Catherine House, but also because I think the issue of homelessness is such a really important issue for all of us in the community who do have the opportunities, who don't find ourselves in the scenario where people are experiencing homelessness. It's great that we're giving our time, giving our energy, giving our money to be able to help and work on that particular issue. So I'm very pleased to be here today with a group of people who think very much about those same sorts of issues. What I wanted to do today, and the reason I was, technology just, no, or not? How about I page down? I'll page down. Old school is sometimes the best. Is that working now? Yes, it is working now. So the reason I was asked today is to share with you a little bit about CityPulse, which is an initiative that PwC launched middle of last year, and we launched this across the whole of the country. So I want to share with you a bit about CityPulse Adelaide, and I also want to talk a little bit about two really important things that are going on in the South Australian landscape that I'm hoping you'll find interesting, that is a very different Adelaide of the future for the one that I suspect that I certainly have grown up in and been involved in, and I suspect many of you as well, which is around defence industries as well as future industries. So to talk a bit about CityPulse, something we wanted to do was, something we didn't want to do was like so many surveys that go out and talk about what are the top 10 livable cities in the world, or how does Melbourne and Sydney compared to Singapore and London. And we didn't want to do that for two reasons. One is because lots of other people have done it. But secondly, because we went, for the people who live in our cities, they're not looking to move to Singapore or London or New York. We live in Adelaide, or we live in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane. And we actually wanted to do something that actually looked at the city in the context of itself and how different parts of the city works when it comes to living and working and playing. And what can that tell us more about the city we're in, its strength, what works, but also what are the challenges? You know, where are the opportunities to do something different, and how can we start a conversation in our city about what the future looks like and how we can come together, government, business, the private sector, community groups, to actually make a difference to that future. So that's very much what we set about looking to do. Now, for those of you back of the room, I'm not expecting you to read this slide. I wasn't sure if we would have massive screens or not today, but don't worry. This slide's here for two reasons. One is to tell you that because at our heart, or should I say in our history, we are a firm of accountants. So this work is backed up by an awful lot of data. We're not out there just spruiking opinion and views for the sake of it. We wanted to build it data. So we've taken data from about 43 different data sets that have never been put together before and put them together to look at a city in the context of live, work and play. And very briefly, when we're thinking about live, we're talking about access to amenities, access to healthcare, access to hospitals, access to schools. We're talking about crime rates in the area. We're talking about health, hospital, primary health care and doctors. But we're also talking about housing affordability. How easy is it to buy a house compared to other places in that area? What's the level of people who are renting and what are they paying as a portion of their income in rent or as a portion of their income as a mortgage payment? When we're talking about working, we're talking about how much is their economic activity going on in the area where they live? What's their access to places where there are jobs, where job growth is actually occurring? And what's the level of welfare dependency? And when we come to play, we're talking about access to bars, access to restaurants, but access to fitness facilities, access to beaches and national parks and open ground, and those kind of attributes that drive how it feels to be in an area. I'll steal a bit of thunder for later on, but I suspect it won't surprise many people that when it comes to play, Adelaide rates off the map compared to nearly every other state in Australia. Because when you're measuring your ability to access a beach or the hills or a wine region or national parks within a half an hour from where you live, we're pretty blessed. And that will be a bit of the story as we get through a few of the slides. The broader narrative, though, that is important, as I talk you through now how that actually looks for our city in work, live and play, we're going to show you a whole bunch of colours of the map. Orange says significant above average, red says significant below average. It's really important you don't read that as really good or really bad. It's Adelaide compared to itself. So the ones that are red showing us where opportunity is to do something different and to change the game. We're not trying to call out which suburbs are the best and which suburbs are the worst, but to call out against those factors where suburbs rate against each other. So let me start with the first one, as I juggle all my pages here, which is live. So what you're going to see, and I'm sorry if the slide's not as big for everyone to see, a map of Adelaide. As I said, the orange reflecting those suburbs which on all those factors rated really highly for live, and the red being which ones relate really below average in terms of those live metrics. Now the really important reflections out of this is probably a couple of things. So first of all is the one that surprised everyone when we launched this, is the most livable city by the suburb or area of Adelaide by these measures was Plympton. Why does Plympton rate so well? And equally, it's not just Plympton and those surrounding suburbs of Richmond, but you're at that northeast corridor, Paradise, Windsor Gardens, and then in the early suburbs of Goodwood. So there's a couple of things that really jump out around these parts of Adelaide. The first is their access to light transport options. We're talking about the tram line and the O-Bahn line. The two things that fundamentally change those areas that mean not only can they drive to access all of those amenities, but they have public transport, for easy, accessible public transport that gets them to those places. The places that are on train lines don't get the same benefit, as you can see, but it is those on those light rail options. Equally, those suburbs have access, extraordinary access to amenities and all of the things that rate and live without the price tag. And this is the thing that so differentiated Adelaide from when you were looking at, when we did this same analysis and same data sets in the other capital cities in Australia, is that those suburbs with the enormous access also were the ones that were quite affordable, and why you saw those suburbs really rating significantly well from a live point of view. At the other end of the spectrum, and I'm going to dwell on this a little bit longer, and excuse me as I briefly go away from the mic, they've given me a laser pointer, but I'm not quite sure about them. I'm going to talk a bit to this area here, what I call the Northwestern Suburbs Challenge. And I'll bring that to life a little bit later when I talk about the defence story. But you'll see on this live rating, when you talk about our Northwestern suburbs, Port Adelaide surrounding does not rate well when it comes to access to amenities, to the affordability of housing, for the scale of those who are not on welfare dependency. And I'll talk a bit further later about what some of that means in terms of challenge. Let me go to work now. And the first thing about work is to basically say we are a CBD-centric city at this point in time. And if you have access to the CBD, you have great access from a work point of view. And the further you stretch out, the harder that becomes. Now, I suspect you didn't need me to pull up 43 data sets and put them together to tell you that. But it's probably more pronounced in Adelaide than we saw in again, any of the other capital cities as we did this analysis. But it really does call out also the bleedingly obvious challenge of Adelaide, which is as you get north and as you get south, that gets harder and harder. And one of the things we talked about when we released our report around CityPulse is that there's been a lot of focus and investment over the last few years in South Australia around our northern suburbs. We had a northern economic plan. We had a real focus and understanding about the impact of the closure of Holden's. And equally, we would talk long and hard about how we didn't feel the hurt that we thought we were going to feel because of a lot of those initiatives. And there's been a lot of new investment into the northern suburbs. And the thing we did actually call out as we were releasing and talking about this report in a conversation is, as a community, we have to be really careful we don't forget about the south. And we don't forget about our southern suburbs, that growth belt, and jobs and economic activity and access to those jobs, as we want a community that doesn't get more and more isolated the more and more we stretch north and south. Because we also would have noticed they didn't rate well on the live side of side of the equation, or on the play side of the equation. We haven't invested in the economic infrastructure and the social infrastructure the further north and south that you actually get. The last thing I'll just note around the work slide, and excuse me again, just ducking to the map. This bit here. We have, sitting in that little square there, what looks like an outlier, really above average when it comes to work, and it was also significantly above average when it came to live and play. That's Mawson Lakes. This is an area that didn't exist 20 years ago. And the reason we called that out is because this Mawson Lakes is a great example of when you invest in economic activity, defence precinct, social infrastructure, housing, playgrounds, parks, environment that people wanted to live in, infrastructure, transport, a university as a central hub, what can it do in a relatively short space of time? And Mawson Lakes is the perfect example of that. The last one is play, and I'm not going to dwell on it only because everything we did in play reinforced to us that when we had to move the bar a bit to be able to distinguish above average and below average. But if you compared us to every other city, if we'd chosen to do that, it just all would have been above average. I would still note though that even having said that, when you look at that Northwestern Suburbs, and that Northwestern Suburbs has exact access to some great beaches, and even despite that, it doesn't rate anywhere near as well as other parts of Adelaide when it comes to the equation around play. So I'd like to talk now just briefly about two aspects and themes that we wanted to draw out when we did our CityPulse work. And the first one was the defence industry story. Apologies for those who have heard it or have read about it in the Advertiser. We did a lot of this work in partnership with the Advertiser as part of their Future Adelaide series. And let me just reinforce the defence story. And this is some analysis PwC did back in October 2017. This is a conservative view of a $90 billion guaranteed investment in future naval shipbuilding in this state that will generate at least a further 8,000 jobs, and they are the direct countable jobs that will flow from this work. And the message that if you remember one thing as you take away around the defence story, that spend and the economic activity that we conservatively believe that will generate for South Australia is the equivalent of 3.4% increase in gross state product year on year over the 40 years of that program. That is the same GSP that our mining industry contributes to South Australia today. We're going to build the equivalent of another mining industry every year for the next 40 years. That's the scale of what this spend actually delivers for our state. So that's the upside. This is pure guesswork for us. We don't know this. But that 8,000 jobs, where are they largely going to be? Back of the envelope. A good half of them at least are going to be based out at the Naval Shipbuilding Precinct at Osborne. A chunk of them will be in the city. Head offices will establish around the city, and we've seen that with certainly Naval Group have done that, as well as those Tier 2 suppliers, but also out at the Mawson Lakes Defence Precinct and BAE would be a good example of there. But those 4,000 jobs based at Osborne, Northwestern Suburbs. So we drew out of the last census data, those people who have already been working in Osborne in the naval shipbuilding over the last 20 years, where have they been living and how do they get there? So these two graphs tell you two things. First of all, the vast majority of people who work at Osborne live at Osborne or the very near suburbs. It also tells you, the graph on the left tells you that if you wanted to have a 30-minute commute in peak hour, the red little line around that, you're going to live either on the coast, in those northwestern suburbs, and a little bit into the north and not more. But if you're going to rely on public transport to get you to Osborne, you're going to be about 3 stops down the outer harbour line. You're going to get nowhere in half an hour. So, 4,000 new jobs, a great new industry, and it's going to be located here with a lot of workers. One road in, one road out. And to get to that road, you have to get your way through Port Adelaide. Okay. Very poor social infrastructure, very little investment in transport, very little investment in economic infrastructure to support that. And this is just a conversation about the workers. If you're a defence industry organisation establishing here, where's your supply chain going to be? How is that supply chain going to get to you in an effective and efficient manner to be a world-leading defence business? And this is the challenge that we called out as part of this analysis. And this needs government, state, federal, local government coming together. It needs a coordinated thought process to how can we make the sort of investments now, because we have certainty for the next 40 years. How often do you get that kind of certainty over 40 years? And that's the enormous challenge that we've called out and that we're really looking to work with government and with the business community in terms of bringing about a different change. The last piece I'd just like to reflect on, and I don't know how many of you sort of are familiar with this story, but this is the changing South Australia when it comes to our economy and what our future looks like. future industries. And I'll start with pointing out, overlaid over our CityPulse work, we have some really extraordinary precincts that are now evolving and developing at pace, that are organisations are coming together, a bit like moths to flames, where you can collaborate, innovate, and generate different approaches and different ideas. So we talk about Tonsley Innovation Precinct, Lot 14 we're now seeing evolved on the old Royal Adelaide Hospital, the Biomed City at the west end of North Terrace. We've talked about Osborne, we've talked about Mawson Lakes and the Edinburgh Park facility. And what are we seeing that means when it comes to, if I get that right, oh dear. That's all right, thanks, Colin. So we're seeing the emergence of investment and businesses that are names that I suspect are not that familiar to you. So starting with space, the extraordinary announcement of a new space agency, the Australian Space Agency, based here in South Australia. We have an organisation called Myriota, spun out of UniSA, near-orbit satellites that are going to fuel the Internet of Things across the globe and already are. We have defence industries, businesses like Nova Systems, started up by Jim Wally, our new chief entrepreneur, is one of the key players in the defence sector in Australia, based here in South Australia. Energy, investments by international businesses like Sonnen and Tesla. We are the home battery hub of Australia, of the Southern Hemisphere as we speak today. Data, digital, AI and cyber. The University of Adelaide has established the Australian Institute of Machine Learning, based at Lot 14. It is regarded as probably the 4th or 5th best research team on the planet in artificial intelligence. And it's in Adelaide, coming out of one of our universities. Health and biomed. Organisations like MicroX. MicroX are revolutionising X-ray machines. Portable, low cost, mobile X-ray machines. Imagine what that does to healthcare on our planet. And then creative industries. The investments of organisations like Technicolor here into South Australia. You take a business like Mighty Kingdom. Mighty Kingdom is writing software for Lego and Disney here in Adelaide. These are not the industries that necessarily you think immediately on when you think of Adelaide of the 20 years ago, or maybe even of Adelaide today. But my parting message to you is this is Adelaide of a future, but it's not Adelaide and businesses doing things for Adelaide. It's not businesses doing things even for Australia. These are Adelaide businesses who are changing the world that everyone actually lives in. And this is the future and the city that we see emerging for us in South Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. We'll have to share one. So I'd like to invite questions from the floor.
You're not going to answer?
No.
Welcome. In the Port Adelaide area, you were talking about infrastructure. Does that include housing along the Port River that was proposed some 20 years ago? There was some unsuccessful accommodation at Newport, and extension of other apartments really didn't happen. How do you see it?
Yeah, so I'd say a couple of things. I think it's all of that. We would see that this is not, whilst historically the workers at Osborne have been based at Osborne, if you've ever taken the trip out there, there is a significant amount of social housing that's there, very old social housing. There's a wonderful marina on one side, but it's quite isolated from what the rest of the peninsula is. But if you come down Semaphore and head your way before West Lakes, but equally you come down that corridor that is Port Road, that ring is still very high social housing, and not the social housing that we've invested in, the renewal and refurbishment that we've done in many other aspects. So First of all, we need to provide the social infrastructure. That play slide tells you that you can do all of the building that you want there, but if it's not a place that feels like where you want to live and grow your family, particularly if you've moved here from overseas or interstate, then no amount of private investment is going to change that, and I suspect the Port Adelaide investment experience was a part of that. So it needs that collective investment in social infrastructure and transport infrastructure, as well as combined with a rethink about what our mix is of social housing and private housing in that sector. I think with all of that combination, you're going to see private investors do invest where they see opportunity and where they see return. You need that mix though first. It's not going to happen without some of that choice.
Thanks, Kim. Fascinating, and first of all, thank you for starting your presentation with those words about it's about time we focused about us and not kept looking and stopped comparing to others. That said, the other day the opposition leader bemoaned the fact that the government's looking to external consultants. In the last 24 hours we've had the debacle of EPAS, and only today a couple of deputy executives have left because they got the hump with the restructure. I guess my question, and you might like to comment on, is how match fit is our bureaucracy to actually take us forward for this marvellous opportunity we have?
Yes, my wife may well pay for having me come along to this presentation now. I'd say a couple of things, if I can, in relation to that. I would say that the opportunities and change that we're seeing in South Australia is not a byproduct of one side of government or another. You know, we had 16 years of a Labor government, and a lot of the really positive, great opportunities that are existing in South Australia are not just born off the last 9 months. But I will also comment that change does bring opportunity, it brings fresh ideas, and it injects confidence. We as a firm saw a lot of green shoot opportunities that were emerging in South Australia, and there's just no doubt that a change brought about confidence to invest, confidence to make decisions, and that has catapulted a number of the things that we're actually observing. I would say too that our new state government is certainly bringing about a significant refresh of the public sector, a refocus in its structure, but equally in terms of the leadership within a number of the key agencies that are very focused on what a future Adelaide looks like and the choices and decisions that need to be made to get there. And I certainly feel much more confident that that's just an ongoing evolution and one that will lead us towards making the good investment choices and decisions. Without tripping too dangerously into a part of what you described, IT systems often are challenged for a multitude of reasons. I would encourage anyone to actually read the full report that Solomon has put out around our hospital systems, but also recognise that the vendor of that system has actually invested enormously in the state, has actually opened up the APIs for the system to go around in EPAS, and there are other states around the country that actually contemplate that South Australia may be one of the first states that truly get digital health right and actually enable new innovative businesses to connect in and build the apps for that rather than a big global vendor. So as all things in life, perhaps a bit of watch this space and let's judge it by looking back in 5 to 10 years' time would be a reflection as well.
Excellent talk. I was around as consul for Sweden when the submarine, the Collins class, was first started, and I was there during the whole of that build. There was a separate story behind that build, in that there was another industry, as it were, behind that. And that was all the people from Sweden and elsewhere who came out to Adelaide. The staff brought their wives and children. They all needed to go to school. They all went to supermarkets. They all wanted housing. They all wanted to rent something. Every Swedish parliamentary committee came out. There were dozens of them came out with all their entourage. One group, there was 38 or 40, I think it was 38 of the members of what is called the Landowners Party over there. They're all the counts and countesses and barons and baronesses of the southern Sweden. They came out and spent a few days in Adelaide. The point is that this is almost an export area in itself, that the number of visitors that will come here because of what's going to happen, if that hasn't been enumerated and thought about, it needs to be, because those people are going to need the services that we should offer them, and that's a whole new industry.
I couldn't agree more. I don't think it's any coincidence that we now celebrate a French festival in South Australia on an annual basis. I also think it's no coincidence that we're investing in French language schools in our education system. But equally, that's what we should do, because the more we are part of a global economy, the more we will have global opportunities. So couldn't agree more. Cool.
Thank you. Look, we have run out of time for questions, and I know there are a couple of others, so perhaps you'll be cornered in a moment. I'd like to invite members to stand and thank Kim.